but as well the international multilateral order altogether. This way doesn't allow Europe to count on the West as it used to be. Secondly, China is rising as a new global player, as a new global power, and is expanding its sphere of influence rapidly as well into Europe. The confrontation of national superpowers all together. This way doesn't allow Europe. The confrontation of these two superpowers leaves the EU with the challenge of rethink and consequently rebuild its future perspectives and its role in the world. And this is not only about persisting in the competition of the superpowers, it is above all about establishing a new European geostrategic identity, define strategic ambitions and pursue opportunities for international leadership and promoting multilateralism and its institutions. But it is clear that in order to develop this necessary global state capacity, Europe must be united and engage in common action based on common values. So we are very happy that today our panelists will share with us their knowledge about the current state of these developments and shed light on them from different viewpoints, distinguishing positions of the US, of China, of Russia, and of course, the European Union. We want to thank our panelists for their interest, for their availability to participate, and we are very happy that Yorgos Kafidas is moderating this panel for us. I would now give the floor to Ari Papasotirion, who is the director or the president of the board of our partner institute, for his introductory words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. On behalf of the Institute of International Relations, I also welcome you to this discussion. We are now in the third phase of international politics post-Cold War. The first phase was the unipolar moment when the 1990s, when the United States was the only superpower. Then came 9/11, when for a while we focused on international terrorism. The third phase is now the return of great power rivalries, with the rise of China above all, but also with Russia after from 2012 becoming increasingly antagonistic towards the West. Now, a key factor in the future will be whether the West will remain united. That will depend to some extent on the November elections in the United States. If, as the Gallups now indicate, there will be a change in the president, then we are likely to see a strengthening again of the West. But still, regardless of what happens with the Western alliance, the EU is a sui generis actor, not exactly a great power, but some say it's a soft power, a great power in soft power terms, and so on. Thus, we need to contemplate here in Europe what our role is going to be, either alongside the United States or somewhat more autonomously. Right, I'll conclude here, and let's move forward with the panel. Right.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending upon which time zone you're in. I want to welcome you all to what will surely be a very interesting online debate on a very pressing topic. A big thank you to Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and to the Institute of International Relations of Padua University for organizing this event. We're really excited and honored to have here with us today joining 5 distinguished speakers that will touch upon different aspects of this new post-pandemic reality for the EU and the challenges the EU is facing. So we're here to examine the options, the chances, and the opportunities for the EU in this new environment. And I will first turn to Tori Taussig. Tori is a research director in the project on Europe and the transatlantic relationship at the Harvard Kennedy School and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. And she will speak about the future of the transatlantic relationship in a time where relations between the EU and the US seem to be at an all-time low. So, Tore, thank you very much for being here with us, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for those introductory remarks. It's nice to virtually at least be with all of you today, and I look forward to this discussion. I think the conversation about how the transatlantic relationship or the broader West can work together on China strategy is one of the most important issues that we face this year and in the years ahead. So I'm glad that your two organizations have put together this conversation. So as I believe the only US-based panelist on the call, what I'll do is give what I find, my brief overview of the US-China relationship, where the United States sees Europe as fitting into greater US-China competition, and then how we might see strategy change under a new administration should a Biden candidate be elected in November. So to start, what does the U.S.-China relationship look like now? In general, I think we're looking at an era of long-term strategic competition between the United States and China. What do I mean by strategic competition? That means that the tensions, the competitive aspects of the relationship span economic, technological, political, and security dimensions of the relationship. So we're not just looking at increased trade competition. We're not just looking at increased security tensions in the Asia Pacific. This is really broad-based competition between the United States and China that is likely to continue in the years ahead, regardless of whether there is a second Trump administration, second Trump term, or a new US administration. But what are we seeing now under the current Trump administration and US approach toward China? First, we're seeing increased calls for what many have come to know as quote unquote economic decoupling. We have an ongoing trade war with China that was picking up steam even before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're seeing increasing calls for decoupling from the US administration during the COVID-19 pandemic. What does decoupling mean? I define it as a dismantling of cross-border supply chains, a nationalization of supply chains, a call for reshoring of US companies. I think we've seen this pick up in the pandemic because the United States has noticed that it is overly dependent on certain manufacturing goods, health supplies from China, and is looking to strengthen its domestic industries on this front. However, we're also seeing increasing decoupling again from China as well, not just during the pandemic, but in previous years. And I think if we look at actions from the Chinese Communist Party, from Chinese industries, we've seen a push toward strengthening manufacturing of enhanced technologies at home so that China does not have to rely on the US and Western supplies as much as it did in the past. And just to put forward one example, Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei used to rely on US components for its smartphones that it no longer does. So I think a big component of this competitive relationship has been this focus on decoupling, but it hasn't just been from the United States. I think we're seeing this trend from both China and the US. While many aspects of Chinese behavior under Xi Jinping, I think, warrant this lens of strategic competition, increasing authoritarianism at home, enhanced military assertiveness in the South China Sea, economic predatory actions further abroad, including in Europe, all of which has led to, again, a justification for this more competitive lens from the United States. I do worry that we are entering into a new type or a new phase of a Cold War in which the lines of communication between the US and China become so strained that cooperation, even on shared critical interests, whether that be climate change or non-proliferation, become difficult and perhaps impossible. So that's where I see the US and China relationship right now, an increasing focus on strategic competition, enhanced calls for decoupling under the COVID-19 pandemic time, and on the worrying side, perhaps this encroachment into a new phase of a Cold War type relationship in which cooperation may not be possible or feasible in the years ahead. Now, I'd like to say a few words about how the United States views China in this new constellation of power, this kind of new framework of competition with China. And I think it's fair to say that under the Trump administration, the general approach toward Europe has been one of asking European allies to choose between strong economic and security ties with the United States and those relations with China. I was based in Berlin last year and saw this choice type mentality play out in the Huawei debate, where the United States effectively threatened the German government to cut off intelligence sharing if they allowed Huawei to build out some of its 5G network. This threat did not end up coming to fruition, but it was one example of where the US government under the Trump administration has been willing to push Europeans into a framework of choosing between the US and China. I think there are a few reasons why asking Europe to choose will not work, and more broadly, why we are not seeing greater transatlantic cooperation on China. I will put forward just three very brief reasons. One, and I'm curious to hear what European colleagues have to say on this issue, because again, this is just my American approach towards the situation. But one reason I think we're not seeing greater transatlantic cooperation toward China now is because European countries seek a very different relationship with China than the United States does. In general, there is a greater value in Europe placed on economic engagement with China and greater multilateral cooperation with China in the Paris Climate Accords, in the Iran nuclear accords. It doesn't mean that there are not shared grievances toward China, but there's more incentive in Europe to maintain trade, economic, multilateral ties with Beijing to achieve shared interests in the Europe-China relationship. Second reason I think we're not seeing more transatlantic cooperation on China now is that Europe, the European Union, is divided on how best to pursue a China strategy. On the one hand, you have Central and Eastern European countries that are less willing, perhaps, to push back on Chinese human rights abuses, aggression in the South China Sea, over concerns that that will create a backlash from China, Chinese investments in domestic industries. And I think we can also say that there are varying degrees of concerns over what the actual security risks of engaging with China, either on a technological standpoint or an economic standpoint, actually are. So for example, there's differences in sentiment over whether there's enhanced political influence from China when there are economic investments made in ports, in critical industries, differences in how Europeans view security risks from, for example, Huawei building out 5G technology, all of which make it very difficult for the European Union and Europe more broadly to come to a shared China strategy. So that's the second reason. The third and final reason I'll give for why we don't see greater transatlantic cooperation on China is because of actual tensions and strains within the transatlantic relationship that have very little to do with China. These have, of course, been exacerbated under the Trump administration, but to give a very concrete example, I think it's difficult for the US and the EU to get on the same page about how to approach shared grievances on unfair Chinese trade practices while the Trump administration has been pursuing steel and aluminum tariffs on the European Union or continuing to threaten auto imports from Germany. More broadly, I think that there's a deficit of trust within the transatlantic relationship that is making even a conversation on how to approach this broad, systemic, strategic challenge of China together. And this is where I hope a new administration could improve transatlantic ties fundamentally, and then also in enhancing cooperation on China. Now I'll close by saying a few words on how I think the US election could influence US-China relations if there were to be a change in administration. First, the ways in which it may not change. I think we're seeing general, at least superficial, surface level, bipartisan agreement that engagement with China in recent decades has not been as advantageous for US interests as it has been for Chinese interests. And that there is a need to recalibrate the US-China relationship on trade and on security matters to better pursue US interests. That being said, I think a Biden administration or a new Democratic administration would have a very different approach in how to handle that understanding of a challenge from China. I think we have to start by acknowledging that China's position under the Trump administration has actually grown stronger in Asia and elsewhere in the world, including in Europe, and that a different approach is needed if we are to recalibrate this relationship. First, the trade war that has been pursued by the Trump administration has actually hurt American economic interests, particularly in the farming and agricultural sector. We've seen very little progress on the actual drivers of economic grievances, be that theft of intellectual property or unfair subsidies of Chinese companies. And third, if we are to view China as a strategic competitor, I think it's fair to say that China wants a polarized and paralyzed America that is less able to project a strong image of liberal democracy in the world. And in this sense, President Trump has been playing to China's advantage. So if we were to have a Biden administration next year, I think you would still see a view from the top that China is a real challenge to American security interests in Asia, to economic interests more broadly. There's still the view that China is the United States' most serious competitor. I think the biggest difference you would see is a greater interest in the United States working with allies more to change Chinese practices and to have China be held to higher standards, particularly in the trade field. That's going to require a new administration to reverse many of the Trump administration's actions that have weakened America's intrinsic advantages. America's alliance system. America has the broadest network of alliances around the world that China is incapable of matching. I think we could say China's only allied relationship may be with North Korea, and it's not even in an allied type position. So there's the alliance system. There's also the soft power of the United States and the image of American democracy that I think has taken a real hit in these last few years that a new administration would have to tackle in the first year and first few months of an administration. There's also the lack of American global leadership in multilateral fora that China is now filling, whether that be on the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council that the United States has pulled out of, the International Telecommunications Union. We've seen Trump threaten to withdraw from the World Health Organization. These are all areas where China is now moving in to fill a leadership vacuum from the United States, where I think you would see a reassessment from a new US administration. Lastly, I think we would see a greater focus on challenging Chinese human rights abuses, whether that be the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang province, and tougher responses to, for example, the imposition of a national security law in Hong Kong. And I think we would see a US administration ask allies to take a stronger stance on those issues as well. Finally, and actually this is my last point, I think if we were to have a new US administration, there would still be, alongside a focus on strategic competition, a recognition that the United States will have to work with China on global challenges from health security to climate change and non-proliferation. So while this competitive lens would maintain, I see it as pragmatic and clear-eyed about the areas where the United States and allies will need to continue to work with China on shared global interests. And I'll stop there.
Tori, thank you very much. It is really interesting for us to have that American perspective. I will turn now to Anna Katarina Stahl to offer some thoughts on China in the EU. Anna Katarina Stahl is Policy Fellow for Foreign and Security Policy at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. Anna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for giving me the opportunity to join this debate. What I would like to do is actually to give you a European perspective and to focus on three main points. So first, the notion of EU strategic sovereignty, then the EU's response to the COVID-19 crisis, and finally, the EU's relations with China. So I think we should really start this debate to focus on the notion of the EU strategic sovereignty. We have seen last year a new EU leadership, and this new EU leadership has really put a major focus on working on the EU's geopolitical identity. Ursula von der Leyen, the new president of the European Commission, mentioned that she really wants to lead a geopolitical commission. And this new debate about the EU's geopolitical identity took place against the background of a changing international landscape. And as Tori mentioned, already in the past years, we have seen growing big power rivalry, in particular between the United States and China. And that, of course, is challenging for the European Union. And the European Union is more and more in a difficult position to actually defend its own interests and values. And of course, in the past, we have seen that Europeans always had a hard time to exert influence, mostly because of a lack of a collective strategy and also a disunited position by the different member states. But so against this changing international environment, we see now that there's a new debate at European level about the necessity of the European Union to really boost its strategic sovereignty. And what we mean by that is basically the ability of the European Union to maintain its independence in the world, and to also have an independent position with regards to this growing great power competition that we are witnessing. So this was just a background about this debate of EU strategic sovereignty and how did this play out now in the current coronavirus crisis. I would argue that actually the pandemic has reinforced the necessity for the European Union to become a global actor and to really foster its strategic sovereignty. Initially, with the outbreak of the pandemic, we have seen that it was very challenging for the European Union, mostly because while the European Union was dealing with this health emergency in a rather uncoordinated way. So we saw uncoordinated national crisis responses by different European member states. But then over time, we are seeing now a more coordinated common European response, both to this health emergency that we're still witnessing, but also in terms of the long-term economic crisis. And one major example for that is the proposal by the European Commission made in May to have a coronavirus recovery program. And this is really a clear sign for further European integration. And of course, the negotiations of this recovery plan are ongoing. And it's one of the key priorities of the German Council presidency that started last week. And we will still have to see how this will play out, but I think it's a really important signal in terms of further European integration. And in parallel to this trend towards a more common European response, we have seen that the European Union was also able to act internationally. So the European Union has supported different multilateral organizations and multilateral initiatives to fight the coronavirus, for instance, in the G20, but also with regards to the WHO. The European Union has also supported countries affected by the virus, most notably developing countries in Africa. So clear signs for a stronger European role at international level. At the same time, I think what is important is that in this current crisis, really, it showed to European leaders that the European Union needs to position itself with regards to these two great powers and not be caught in this big power rivalry. And contrary to what it may appear, I think the crisis could actually be an opportunity to boost the EU's geostrategic ambitions and maybe even act as a catalyst to foster the EU's strategic sovereignty. And one example for that is the EU's relationship with China. So of course, and Tori mentioned that the pandemic really shows the ambition of China to become a global leader. And it therefore has reinforced certain trends in terms of EU-China relations. So I don't think the pandemic really shows something new, but rather it reinforces trends that we have seen already in the past. And I would argue that there are two major trends in terms of EU-China relations. First, there is a growing rivalry between the European Union and China. And second, at the same time, we also see a growing need of cooperation between the European Union and China, in particular with regards to global challenges. So if we look at this first trend, we have seen over the past years that the policy of the European Union towards China has shifted. European leaders have adopted a much more realistic tone. And this has culminated in a policy document that was adopted last year by the European Union, where the European Union for the first time labeled China as an economic competitor and spoke about a systemic rivalry, mentioning different models of governance. And with the pandemic, we can see that this chapter of systemic rivalry actually is reopened. In particular, we have seen that China has been engaged in a so-called mask diplomacy, supporting other countries affected by the virus by sending equipment and medical teams. And that caused political tension with the European Union. Because in addition to this mask diplomacy, China has also been engaged in a disinformation campaign through social media, but also through state-backed media outlets. This campaign of disinformation, coupled with this mass diplomacy, led to tensions between the European Union and China. And the most visible case in terms of these diplomatic tensions is Italy. We have seen that Italy has been the country in Europe that has been mostly hit at the beginning by the virus, and we have seen that China offered support to Italy. And it offered support to Italy at a time where the European Union was still struggling and coming up with a more coordinated response. So because of this intra-European lack of solidarity, China could position itself as a partner to Italy. And that caused tensions with the European Union because in the end, the European Union and other European member states also supported Italy and even provided more support than China, but the European Union got less credit for it. And therefore, we could even argue that China somehow undermined the European efforts to support Italy in the pandemic. And I would be very curious if, for instance, in Greece, we have seen a similar phenomenon. But at the same time, we can see that in the current pandemic, there's also a need to cooperate with China. So even though we have a very tense diplomatic relationship now between China and the European Union, only a few weeks ago, we have seen an EU. It was the first time that the new EU leadership encountered President Xi Jinping. And at the end of the summit, the European leadership reaffirmed its commitment to engage and cooperate with China. And in particular with regards, of course, to the COVID-19 crisis. And we have seen first initiatives of collaboration between the European Union and China, mostly with regards to the coronavirus vaccine, the development of a vaccine. What I think is very important is to mention that both the European and the Chinese leadership have stated that this vaccine would be a common public good, accessible to all. And that's a very different message as to compared to what we hear from the Trump administration in the United States. And in May, the European Union organized also a pledging event to raise funds for the development of a vaccine. And this event was also partly supported by China and other allies of the European Union. So to conclude, I would argue that unlike what it might appear at first glance, the current coronavirus crisis can actually become a stimulus to advance the EU's strategic sovereignty. And to reach these objectives, European policymakers would need to foster the EU's economic and diplomatic independence with regards to big powers, China, but also with regards to the United States, while at the same time trying to continue to engage in a rule-based multilateral cooperation, in particular with China, to tackle global challenges such as the current pandemic, but also other global challenges like climate change. That, of course, the European Union is not able to address by itself. And by doing so, the European Union would oppose the existing trend of growing unilateralism that is provoked by the Trump administration and its America First policy. while at the same time, the European Union is not taking side in the US-China conflict. And I think the recent proposal by Joseph Borrell to have a transatlantic dialogue on China shows the willingness of the European Union to also still have a dialogue with the US. And this is, I think, a very important signal coming from the European Union, so to continue to engage in multilateral cooperation with China, while at the same time also continuing a dialogue with the United States. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anna. Konstantinos Filis, I'm gonna come to you next to talk about Russia in a transforming world and its relations with the EU. Konstantinos Filis is Executive Director at the Institute of International Relations here in Athens. And Konstantinos, the floor is yours.
Thanks, George. I will try to explore two questions during my intervention. First, how Russia approaches its relations with the West. And second, what position is Moscow pursuing in the great global US-China confrontation? Right now, Russia is widely seen as a revisionist power on many levels. Given the mutual distrust and conflicting interests of Russia and the West, and the return, God was never completely gone, of the sphere of influence mindset, the outlook for Russia's relations with the West is not positive. Moreover, the two sides' disparate views concern more than just liberal democracy and governance, extending to more practical matters, such as the deployment of NATO forces on Russia's borders and Russia's meddling in the affairs of Western states. Beyond that, Moscow sees its own resurgence as having caused discord. In its view, a significant portion of the West would prefer to see Russia mired in the weak position it occupied in the 1990s. Russia has concluded that its Western partners think of it as weak and overstretched, a country with which they needn't seek compromise or on which they want to impose their terms. Due to this pervasive mistrust, the Kremlin is not inclined to search for common denominators with the West, even when they are needed, for instance, to ameliorate the effects of the economic sanctions after the Crimea illegal annexation, because it feels either that any agreement will not be respected and that it will be fooled, or that by compromising, it will show weakness and will therefore be regarded as a junior, unequal partner that lacks negotiating clout. The West is seen as a disruptive force that uses international law and treaties on an ad hoc basis, thus undermining this instrument's significance, while also promoting Western rules of the game that are unacceptable to Russia, which in turn is seeking support from other powers that are equally disappointed. Moscow accuses the West, and especially Washington, of being keen to advance regime change and wants to prevent it from undermining the Russian regime from within. Moscow also sees expansion of the anti-Russian front and is thus turning to the East, especially to China, as a counterweight to its ongoing alienation from EU and US, energy and trade ties that, along with political considerations perhaps, do not allow for a radical reversal of Moscow's orientation, but we do see Moscow participating actively in partnerships that call into question Western dominance on a local level, like the Shanghai Cooperation, but on the world stage as well, through the BRICS mechanism. The question here is if these revisionists manage to bridge their differences and assorted points of reference at some stage, will they maintain their competitive stance on a regional level or even at some point favor stabilization of their relations with the West on better terms for themselves, but without provoking further turmoil in the international system? Turmoil that will have negative repercussions for them as well. And this is because in the scenarios where US power fades or is withdrawn significantly, or a post-Western multipolar world renders Western institutions and mechanisms ineffectual, calling into question the current global order, even the competitors of the US would face serious repercussions on various levels during the transitional phase that would follow. Moreover, the power vacuum on the global stage would have a decisive impact on security issues, leading to escalation in regional competition and conflicts on the local scale, which would occur with greater frequency. So, can we label Russia and China as uncomfortable partners and systemic competitors, or are they becoming hostile powers and ideological opponents, despite lacking an alternative model other than authoritarianism? In both cases, their role is instrumental rather than inspirational, and unlike the Soviet Union, they're not exporting global ideology. Consequently, should we see them as two actors with a shared outlook on the international state of affairs, operating jointly and in coordination, like, for instance, the consistent dissension in the Security Council, at least on critical international developments and shared goals and intentions, focusing on the de-Westernization of the current global order? With multipolarity underway, I think we all agree on that, can the US and the EU, if we assume that they are on the same page, and as it has been mentioned, they are not actually on the same page for now. So can the US and the EU re-Westernize the planet? Do Russia and China need each other more than each of them needs the West? And if so, will this enable them to maintain a unified front and deal effectively with ongoing disagreements and fluctuating tensions with the West? Of course, we can't rule out that, due to their difference in caliber, they may diverge in the future once they become regional competitors, but a multipolar or non-unipolar new order is inevitable. The West, meanwhile, accuses Putin's China of ignoring basic rules of the international community and behaving like a spoiler player, adopting an intensely revisionist agenda, violating international and/or bilateral agreements, investing in the dysfunctionalizing of institutions, tampering with elections, most notably in the US, and trying to weaken the EU. And there are even those who put the increase in refugee flows from Syria in 2015 down to a conscious choice on the part of Moscow, a choice aimed at undermining European cohesion. So the West also accuses Russia of oppressing internal opposition and rules in an autocratic manner, initiating global hacking campaigns and through its information operations, attempting to influence the citizens and by extension, the decision-making processes of targeted countries. What is more, lacking an alternative model for stability, security, and prosperity that would attract states and leaders, it shows its taste for strong, usually autocratic nation states with leaderships that are susceptible to Moscow's influence, investing in frustration with supranational organizations like the EU, and in a return to hard national boundaries, while it promises prospective allies that by siding with Moscow, they can protect their positions vis-à-vis the West, and at the same time feel more protected from the latter's interventionist policies, as experienced by Assad. A salient example of this trend is Russia's warm, though not conflict-free, relationship with Turkey. The rapprochement between Moscow and Ankara is at bottom due to their shared stance that the West does not understand them and consents to them without consulting with them or assuaging their concerns. And a last point is, can this situation with the West, between Russia and the West, be reversed? Very briefly, there is an obvious need for Moscow and the West, in spite of their mutual distrust and serious disagreements as have been presented, to find a golden mean in an unstable global environment rife with security challenges and threats. Even today, consultations are being carried out on the military operational level to avoid accidents, not just in Syria, but also on NATO member states' borders with Russia. Moreover, the more moderate Western voices acknowledge the role that Eastern European and Baltic states have played in exacerbating the tensions with Moscow, like in the case of Ukraine, as well as the fact that while Moscow has adopted an assertive policy on many fronts, it is still hanging back from the point of no return. Substantial rapprochement is not feasible under the present conditions, but the gradual adoption of a more functional agenda might prove useful in the future. I think I'll stop here Thank you.
Thank you very much, Konstantine. I will now turn to Vasilis Doussas, who is Academy Fellow at Chatham House in London. And Vasilis will speak about the quest for an autonomous EU action in the geopolitical Bermuda Triangle. Vasilis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yorgos, and my thanks also to the Athens office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and to the Institute of International Relations at Pantheon University. Certainly an honor to be speaking to my home country audience. So many thanks indeed for the invitation. It's very nice to be in the same panel with such esteemed colleagues. So to answer your question in under 10 minutes, I would start off by telegraphically saying that there is space that the EU can occupy in this emergent geopolitical environment, a space for autonomous EU action. But if insufficient attention is paid now in preserving this critical space, and insufficient vigilance is shown now towards the kind of dynamics that can sustain this space, I think this space may and will shrink very quickly. I will perhaps distance myself a little bit from what Professor Phillips described as a move towards a multilateral order, a multipolar order, because I think what the pandemic did was take things that were a little bit unclear, a little bit opaque, and made them a little bit more clear. And for me, at least, what the pandemic made clear was the fact that we were sure that we were transitioning away from a unipolar moment, a unipolar order. But what made it a little bit clear is the fact that we're transitioning into a G2 world. So into a new bipolarity. It might come with a huge asterisk that this will come with regional spheres of influence. It might be more nuanced than the Cold War bipolarity. Nonetheless, the pandemic revealed the intentions of China in a much clearer way, in a much more visceral way. And since we are transitioning into these G2 with that asterisk world, unfortunately, we have to endure a world order that will be much more contested, because this Sino-American rivalry comes with its own confrontational characteristics. So far, the situation might not amount to a new Cold War, certainly not in military terms, but we're seeing palpable signs of dynamics in the geoeconomic sector, where we're seeing this rivalry becoming the all-encompassing framework, the lens through which Europe, much like any other international actor, has to base its own actions. And I would say the feeling in Brussels, despite being in London and keep regular contact with colleagues, policymakers, policy experts in Brussels, the feeling that I'm getting still is that Brussels feels that it's being dragged involuntarily towards this great power competitive arena. And in certain aspects, it is still woefully unprepared. We might have not reached the depths that Tori described of the decoupling between US and China. But still, the main question burning in many of the minds and people in the Brussels bubble, at least, is what the EU can realistically do not to be squeezed between these two global giants, between an assertive, a belligerent United States and an ascendant China. And I think that's the main question that the EU has to ask when maneuvering across this geopolitical Bermuda Triangle, because when you're navigating these murky waters, you need to make sure that your guidance, you're steering the ship is done well enough. The ship itself is solid enough, and then you have a clear direction as to where you want to go. Otherwise, you might get lost in this. I think Tori explained very insightfully where we stand now with the US-EU relationship. The only thing I would add is that looking over the last 4 years, I would say that the US-EU relationship has gone through all the phases of grief One goes to when seeing a close relationship fray. So initially, Europeans went through that state of anxiety that gave way to a state of denial. Then we had a willingness to appease, and finally we had a painful realization that things will probably not go back to where they were. Even with that hope that things might change for the better post-November. This has translated into a difficulty to find issues of substantial alignment, despite the fact, I should say, there is a lot of cooperation, transatlantic cooperation, that still is taking place perhaps below the radar. But interestingly, what exacerbated the transatlantic relationship even further is, in my opinion, something that remains a little bit undetected, is the fact that there is a solidifying consensus amongst the Trump administration, most of US Congress, amongst most of the representatives of the blob of the Washington foreign policy establishment, that China's rise is probably the most clear and present danger to America's long-term strategic interests. But this, instead of re-energizing a transatlantic axis of cooperation, this China factor has served to distort the prism through which America, at least the western part of the transatlantic axis, discusses and engages with the eastern part. Because Washington now views many transatlantic bilateral issues through the prism of Brussels' relationship to Beijing. And as many people said, what happened with Huawei is only the latest, but not the last example of this. Now, turning our attention to China, we have a fraying transatlantic relationship. But if the transatlantic relationship has seen better days, I would also say that the EU's relationship with China has also experienced a fair share of tumult lately. This is encapsulated by what President Macron discussed as the end to an era of naivety. But I would say even pre-COVID, what we saw was probably the most substantive overhaul of Brussels' approach vis-a-vis Beijing in the last 20 or so years, if not longer. We had several issues of contention, thorny issues in the bilateral relationship. We had the Belt and Road Initiative. We had other streams problematic from a European standpoint, streams of Chinese outbound investment and loans. We had concerns about general issues of market reciprocity, openness. We had massive trade and investment imbalances. And of course, we had Beijing's acquisition, especially during the depths of the economic crisis in the Eurozone, acquisition of critical strategic infrastructure across the EU. And Anna Katerina described that this culminated in the report that was published last year, which described the EU not just as a partner, but also as a competitor and as a rival. And this, even pre-COVID, reflected a sharp change in the balance of many of the assumptions that characterized for decades, the Sino-European relationship. And then we had China reorienting its own modus operandi in a way that surprised me, and perhaps we can talk about it later on, with its wolf warrior diplomacy, with its mask diplomacy, with trying to play into divisions amongst EU member states at this time of need in a much more assertive, much more concrete and direct way than previously. So we had the transatlantic relationship that was fraying with a secret hope that things might get better. And then we had a massive eye-opening experience before, but also during the pandemic when it comes to China. And this creates a very different landscape for Europe to navigate. And my personal, very quickly, 3 points on what should substantiate this EU's quest for autonomous action. We shouldn't wait. First, we shouldn't wait for Washington to discover reason again, or for Beijing to show its full deck of cards. Business as usual vis-a-vis both Washington and Beijing is growing harder to sustain. So we should shed many of the illusions. There is no feasible scenario in which the EU can be insulated from this great power competition. So waiting idly for the outcome of the November elections and secretly wishing that there is a Trump election defeat is as misguided as thinking that the momentary truce in the US-China trade rivalry with this phase 1 trade deal is what it is momentary. The clash will persist. We should be highly cognizant of that. The confrontation will persist because at its core, there lies a willingness to claim and to vie for economic and political leadership. So we should act. That's the second point. We cannot afford to be a passive bystander in this. So we can't sit it out. We can't pretend to be equidistant. This might be convenient in the short term, but it cannot be sensible medium to long term. So a lack of active involvement now will most likely result in being forced to take sides, as today's event suggests, the title suggests, and make decisions that are neither in our own interest nor in our diplomatic style. That's why we need to make sure that this doesn't escalate into a hot war, or it doesn't ossify to the point of providing the bedrock for a contracted frozen conflict. And last point, as in dance, we need a nimbler approach. And this requires a more convincing level of European role awareness. What kind of landscape do we want to operate within? How close or how distant do we want to be from each partner? How much power and experience do we have in our hands? And how much power and experience are we willing to invest in? The MFF negotiations, for example, are currently underway, negotiations of the EU's long-term budget. How much do we want to invest in extra power, extra expertise, so as to be able to set the tone and tempo of interaction of ourselves? I think this will help prioritize the actions, the areas where we can take the lead, for example, climate change. Try to make the most of the areas where we choose to follow, for example, trade, or perhaps refuse the dance, the geopolitical dance altogether when confronted with issues that are incompatible, directly incompatible with the core of our positions. You can think of the Iran nuclear deal. You can think of the deal of the century when it comes to the Middle East peace process. You can think of labor standards. You can think trade and investment when it comes to China. Standing our ground cannot be done on every topic and all the time, but it should very much be in play on key issues that merit resistance and appeasement. And I think this tripartite distinction should substantiate a renewed EU push in trying to maneuver this, this Bermuda Triangle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasilis. I will now turn to Marilena Kopa, who is Associate Professor at Padion University in Athens. She will speak about the new opportunities for Europe's security and defense policy. Ms. Kopa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for this lively and very interesting discussion. My intervention will be on a more specific issue, especially on EU defense. So let me start by saying something that we all know, that the pandemic has already had devastating effects at the level of the EU economies. And in this context, EU defense may be one of the sectors most hit strategically, financially, but also politically. The COVID crisis has influenced the global strategic stability and has different consequences for each one of the major issues Europe has to deal with. Concerning the defense sector, what is obvious today is that the pandemic will lead to new cuts of the defense budgets of the member states, something that will definitely have a negative impact also on transatlantic relations. This comes at the worst moment when the objective should be for EU and NATO members alike to act decisively in the changing geopolitical environment and the mounting competition between US and China. But the position of Donald Trump on NATO blurs the picture. how the US will rebalance its relation to NATO will be crucial. Cuts or stagnation of the European defense budget, together with an eventual re-election of Donald Trump, would further complicate the future of the alliance. Still, this could also be an opportunity to reconsider, together with our partners, the whole European defense and security strategy. Beginning with the Brexit referendum, a series of initiatives have characterized the last 4 years at the level of European security and defense. Many of them will slow down or freeze. The European defense budget, as Vasilis mentioned, meaning in the framework of the multi-annual financial framework 2021-2027, that has to be agreed until the end of the year, will definitely be reduced, as the needs created by the pandemic will need important funding. We'll still do not know what will be the final decision of the European Council on the whole of EU budget, but the signs are clear. But what will happen also at the national level is equally important. Some years ago, during the economic crisis of 2008, European governments chose to proceed to the necessary cuts by slashing capabilities on a national level without coordination with the other member states. In doing so, they ignored all the channels of cooperation offered by the EU and NATO. As a consequence, during the period 2007 to 2015, nearly 30% of the EU military capabilities were lost. We should not repeat the same mistake again. However, the signs are not good, as the EU member states reacted to the pandemic not with solidarity, but with an inward-looking mentality. Under these circumstances, member states may try to mitigate the economic impact of the crisis by slowing down, if not reversing, recent feeble increases in national defense budgets. But the way to do it will be of extreme importance, and the only forward-looking way is to coordinate among themselves, among the member states. But no clear sign on that either. So let me just make 3 brief points. First of all, the pandemic may lead to further US disengagement from its global role. It has already been mentioned in this debate. The US has not built a coalition to shape a global answer to the crisis, and it's not coordinating with its allies while attacking at every instance China. So what we face as Europeans is, while we are still dependent on the US for our defense, that the USA may be more focused on China and further neglect Europe. The second point, the pandemic is also affecting the process of EU defense integration by testing Europe's capacity for collective crisis management. Before the coronavirus crisis, there was a new level of ambition in EU defense cooperation. What is more, through the Commission's proposal for a European Defence Fund, funded by the EU budget and oriented to the strengthening of an innovative and competitive European defence industrial and technological base, so for the first time, we witness signs of the communitarian method in security and defense. As a result, we saw a series of new initiatives that would enhance CSDP, among which was also the creation of Directorate General for Defense Industry and Space in the new geopolitical, as it calls itself, European Commission, DG DEFIS. But then 3 things happened. The UK left the EU in January 2020, the new budget faced difficulties to be agreed, and the pandemic occurred. What followed was a shift in EU's defense priority. The most obvious result was the reduction of funding for EU military capabilities and a wave of renationalization in the defense sector. In fact, what is clear is that up to now, the EU has been more ambitious than its individual member states when it comes to commitment. Third point, what will happen with the famous quest for EU strategic autonomy? This idea was based on a balanced relationship with the US, an emerging but strong European industrial defense and technological base, and enhanced cooperation between the member states. Today, the future of EU security and defense ambition is uncertain. Two flagship initiatives that would have contributed to EU strategic autonomy are under great strain. First, military mobility, a PESCO project that aims to enable unobstructed movement of military personnel and assets within the EU, so its funding reduced. The initial Commission proposal was of 6.5 billion euros, and now it's dropped to 1.5 billion. This was a top priority project for countries of Eastern Europe in order for them to face a renewed Russian assertiveness. The second is the European Defence Fund. The original proposal was 13 billion euros for the period 2021-2027. The new budget proposal brings it down to 8 billion, which is still, in my view, quite optimistic because the final decision is not taken. But there is more. On the one hand, the mounting geostrategic competition leads to a tendency of zero-sum thinking, and the question of 5G made this quite obvious. On the other, some member states fear that defense policy could eventually move to a supranational level at a time during which, because of the pandemic crisis, we witnessed nationalistic reflexes. In many EU capitals, there is a negative reaction to the Commission's enhanced role in security and defense, and a tendency to keep the intergovernmental approach as it has been up to now. Let me conclude. The challenges are many, but this crisis could reinforce the need to develop dual-use and cutting-edge digital technologies, very much linked to pandemic preparedness. Hybridity of risks is the new normal, and the limits between internal and external security are more blurred than ever before. Security and defense have also become broader concepts than some years before. In this time of crisis and of severe geopolitical antagonism, the EU should not abandon its ambition to become an autonomous global actor. And it would achieve this by supporting national armed forces and EU initiatives at the same time. We should not create security vulnerabilities that it will take years to be overcome. In these times of crisis, everything becomes possible. With China still unpredictable and with the US remaining a source of uncertainty, the EU will be obliged, in my view, to face its responsibility. How far this may or should go, it's hard to predict. The independent variables will be the economic crisis, the changing security environment, the potential US entrenchment, and EU cohesion. What this all can give, I think it will be our exercise for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marilena. Thank you all for your very interesting remarks. I will now open the floor so that we can have a discussion. First of all, I encourage all our speakers to pose their questions to other speakers if they have any. I think Tori mentioned something at the beginning of the conversation. And I also encourage our viewers to send their questions in the chat and via YouTube if they have any questions. So I can start by asking a question that is related also to the recent pandemic. Has this pandemic changed the way we view US and China and their role and their rivalry? I mean, Vasilis mentioned wolf warrior diplomacy. And have we learned anything different because of this pandemic, which in a way it's still ongoing? And a second point, are China and the US, would they be willing to accept a more autonomous Europe? I mean, the title of our online debate is Choosing Sides. But do we really have, as Europeans, do we really have to choose sides? So I'm going to start with these two questions and then we'll proceed. If you, of course, as I said, if you have any questions or points that you want to make, please feel free to do so. So who would like to go first? Vasilis, yes.
Perhaps on the first part of the question regarding whether this has really shifted our attention or our way of perceiving either. I think with regard to the US, pretty much all has been said and done. Of course, it accelerated many of the negative impressions that we had. We didn't expect anything better. If anything, the actual experience with the current occupant of the White House has exacerbated an already fundamentally negative impression. But I hinted at that in my initial intervention. I was also personally surprised by the way China acted. And I think if I am to put it in a headline, I would say that dealing with China from a European perspective over the last few months has been an eye-opening experience. I think the pandemic accelerated many of the suspicions and the vigilance through which, by which EU and most of its member states has shown towards many of the issues of contention in the bilateral relationship. But what used to be an idea of China carefully calibrating, preparing patiently each move, China was always seen as having a revisionist agenda, but it was always also seen as pursuing this agenda in a carefully calibrated fashion. China was seen as a revisionist power, but as a status quo actor when the global system, faced shocks. We saw the kind of, modest financial intervention diplomacy that China pursued when it comes to Europe in the depths of the Eurozone crisis. It was trying to project itself as a constructive, stabilizing, discreet even at times, a player. And this led to a gradual shift, a strengthening, a firming up of the EU stance vis-a-vis China, culminating in last year's strategic outlook document, which describes China as a rival. And this was groundbreaking, but it describes China's arrival right next to continuing to describe it as a competitor and as a partner. But I think what the crisis did, through some calculated risks the Chinese leadership was eager to take, or through some unforced errors, opened the eyes of many in Europe, and made, as I said, this idea that we can continue with business as usual harder to sustain. So we had the mask diplomacy that at times was so brazen or heavy-handed that rightfully so created a pushback. We had the disinformation campaigns, the cyber attacks, the propaganda campaigns that Anna Katerina mentioned, being adjacent to this mask diplomacy. We had the wolf warrior diplomacy with many Chinese emissaries ditching the niceties of diplomatic talk. For example, saying that pensioners in French hospitals, French retirement homes were being left to die by the official Twitter account of the Chinese embassy, which was then deleted in Paris, or saying or pressuring Western governments, even in the EU, to sing praise for Beijing in exchange for mask shipments. We have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, promoting the conspiracy through Twitter that it was really the US Army who brought the epidemic to Wuhan. And on top of that, we had the draconian national security law in Hong Kong, which, by taking effect, it showed a scope of intervention that was that went far beyond what even the gloomiest analyses had predicted. So all of this substantiates a new stance by China away from what Deng Xiaoping traditionally regarded as keeping a low profile and hiding the capabilities. This, for a long time, substantiated the Chinese approach. And then we moved suddenly, or at least in the public eye, it looked as if it was sudden, towards a Chinese stance that was much more proactive, much more assertive, much more willing to claim China's rightful place in the world. I personally think that more, that less risk-averse Chinese approach has to do with the usual way that China as a regime views risk-taking when there is a huge domestic crisis, of the likes of which we saw in China, especially in the first critical weeks of the pandemic outbreak. But it's the combination, the acceleration of all these elements and the timing. One of the most acute crises for each European government in the last century and for the European project itself. So seeing China playing up some of those divisions, asking praise for its mass diplomacy and so on and so forth, this combination of what it did and the timing when it did, I think has made a European more firm, more assertive stance towards China almost unavoidable. And I know there's variation. There's member states that don't agree with that. There's even people in the EU institutions that don't agree with that. For example, when we had the Foreign Affairs Council, I think it was on the 29th of May, and the issue of the Hong Kong law was put on the table, there was a single European member state that suggested sanctions. So we're by no means united in the way we approach this, but the overall sentiment is that something has changed. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you, Vasilis. Marilena, would you like to jump in? Yes.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Three very brief comments. First of all, to react to your question, I don't think the pandemic created the new geopolitical framework. It was already there, but the pandemic has acted as a catalyst. Things moved quicker during this time. Second point, EU should work for multilateralism while strengthening our role as global actors. But we belong to the West, and the traditional West-East rift exists. But our West front has been broken because of Donald Trump and because of the crisis of the transatlantic link. It has come, as it was very well depicted by Tory, but also by others, it has come under great strain. Hopefully after the elections, we will be able to recreate, or not recreate, revitalize this link, which is absolutely necessary for both sides of the Atlantic, because EU belongs to the West, the partnership is an historic one, it's necessary for both parts, and I believe it will remain strong. Third and last point, if we discuss solidarity with partners, for example, in NATO, we should also discuss solidarity inside the EU, which also came under great strain during the pandemic. Let me just give a very brief example. Italy activated the EU civil protection mechanism in mid-February. Until mid-March, not one EU member state reacted. The consequences of that, I think I don't need to explain, but I think it's something just that we all have to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Marilena. Let's go to Tori and then to Konstantinos.
Thank you. I completely agree with what Vasilis and Marilena have said. I think Vasilis gave a great overview of all of the actions we've seen China carry out throughout the pandemic that have strengthened skepticism within Europe of its relationship with China. I mean, wolf warrior diplomacy, mass diplomacy was mentioned. Some of the really harsh and aggressive rhetoric out of China's disinformation campaign in Europe has been on full display. And we've seen a lot of pushback from European policymakers and a rising awareness from European citizens about some of those challenges that China poses to Europe, in addition to the opportunities that Europe has viewed its relationship with China to date. So I thought that was a fantastic overview, and I completely agree. Just to add the American lens, as has been mentioned a couple times throughout the presentations, the pandemic has served as an accelerator of standing geopolitical trends, of tensions rising within the US-China transatlantic relationship as well. To hone in on a few very specific issues of how the pandemic has changed and accelerated tensions within the US-China relationship. One, as I mentioned earlier, is this desire from US policymakers to nationalize supply chains, to ensure that there is not an overdependence on China for critical, whether it be health or manufacturing products that the US has found itself lacking during this pandemic. And it's also accelerated, I think, on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, this need, again, to reshore US companies, to bring industrialization and supply chains back home. And this crisis, I think, has brought to the forefront that type of mentality. I think within the transatlantic relationship, sadly, this pandemic has been a missed opportunity to enhance global cooperation and enhance cooperation when it comes to China's strategy. I don't want to speak for my European colleagues, but just in conversations I've had with Europeans since this pandemic has started, concerns over President Trump and US global leadership have only worsened during the pandemic. We can go back to...
If I may, why was it a missed opportunity? Is it because of Donald Trump's administration, or are the Europeans also to blame to an extent?
Well, if we look at the role that the United States has played in previous crises, global crises, for example, the Ebola crisis, the United States enacted a very strong and swift international campaign to deal with Ebola, put a ton of funding behind the international response, and we didn't see that this time. The US was absent at the EU's drive for funding for vaccine research. There was no cooperation on the travel ban that the Trump administration enacted in early March that I think caught Europeans completely by surprise. We've seen the US kind of castigate China within the G7 at the expense of coming up with a shared statement from G7 countries. And amidst the pandemic, we've also seen the US administration move on pretty contentious issues like withdrawing US troops from Germany in what appears to be a very hastily and politically made decision. I think I'm being tough on the US administration right now. I think, to your point, we've seen national responses come to the forefront in Europe as well, particularly early on in the crisis. We've seen a more European, a pro-European and solidarity-focused approach more recently. But I think first and foremost, the reason that this is a missed opportunity is because the Trump administration has been unable to forge US leadership that we've seen in previous crises and has not attempted to enact any sort of cooperation with its European partners throughout the crisis.
I think Konstantinos wanted to comment. Yes,
George, thank you. I almost subscribe to what has just been said by Tori. Just two comments. The one regarding Vasilis's comment on China's assertiveness. I agree with him. Just to bring to the audience attention, and to be fair, that there has been an exchange of accusations between the US and China. It was not a unilateral move by China, because let me just remind you that while President Trump congratulated the Chinese president in January for the way he handled the crisis, the pandemic crisis, shortly after the virus became Chinese virus, or a Wuhan virus, as has been said by Minister Pompeo as well. So the climate was mutually negative. It was not, a one-sided situation coming only from the Chinese. And as said by Tori, this was one of the reasons why the G7 failed to issue a joint statement back in March, if I can recall. The second point is regarding Europe, and from strategic dependence, when we talk about European US affairs, from strategic dependence to strategic autonomy, there is a middle way. And I think that what is more realistic, more pragmatic to say is that the EU can have more of a supplementary role. But as said by almost everybody, we first need to repair the damage that Mr. Trump has done. The risk, in my mind, is if the West is not reunited, is that of having an isolated US and a vulnerable EU.
Thank you very much. Yes, Anna, please.
Yeah, I would also like to comment a bit on in terms of China and what Vasilis said. I think it's important to have a bit of a more nuanced approach with regards to China. I would agree with Vasilis that since Xi Jinping came to power, we have seen a more assertive Chinese foreign policy, but I'm not so sure if this is really a long-term policy. When we look at the current pandemic, of course, I think Europe has been hit or caught by surprise with regards to the rhetoric we have seen from China. In the past, for instance, the European External Action Service and the Stratcom East Task Force has mostly looked at disinformation campaigns coming from Russia. And it's something new now that this whole disinformation campaign also comes from Chinese sources. But if we really look at Chinese foreign policy as such, we can also see some parts where China is still willing to cooperate, for instance, in the World Health Organization. And I would really also comment on what has been said previously, that this whole rhetoric is also a response to US foreign policy, that under the Trump administration, there was really this emphasis on putting the blame on China, and some of this disinformation campaign is a response more to the to the US policy. And with regards to wolf warriors, of course, this is one field we see in terms of Chinese foreign policy, but there are also other voices in China. And I think one really needs to be careful to think that because China is this authoritarian regime, because you have the Communist Party, that there's only one fraction. There are different communities that shape Chinese foreign policy. And we really have to see in the long run what kind of Chinese foreign policy we will see. Because the main concern of the Chinese leadership is, of course, to stay in power and to have stability. And China is very much hit by the pandemic, also in terms of economic consequences. And the priority for the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership, is to have economic growth, because that is essential to have stability and to also have legitimacy of the Communist Party. So yeah, just to say that I think in terms of Chinese foreign policy, one has to be a bit more careful and one needs to really have a more nuanced approach.
Thank you, Anna. I would like to focus a bit also on the Greek experience, because Greece as a country has good relations with all of the countries of the big powers we have discussed about, with the US, with China, and with Russia. So maybe this is a question also to our Greek speakers. Can this experience, the Greek view, be, I don't know, the bedrock for a European view as well, or is it Greece just too small a country to be able to provide such a thing? Anyone? No, Vasilis, please, yes.
Just very quickly, also responding to previous comments, a nuanced approach vis-a-vis China and seeing the long-term reaction to this, what I called surprising turn of events, is indeed needed. The wolf warrior diplomacy is not the consolidated consensus within the Chinese foreign policy apparatus, and I should have made that distinction. Also to clarify, well, we've seen more seasoned diplomats saying that this was a mistake. We should also clarify that Europe should be well advised not to uncritically follow the China scare that is becoming some sort of, organizing principle in many corners in Washington. So indeed, I agree with the comments, and I should have made that distinction. Now, Greece, the only thing I would say is that Greece, the Greek experience contains a very valuable lesson for how foresight should be better injected in European foreign policy. Many of the grievances that we had even pre-pandemic with Beijing's acquisition of critical infrastructure in Europe. If the European institutions had not pushed a package of austerity so forcefully and demanded its implementation under the terms that we saw it being implemented during the Eurozone crisis, one has to wonder whether countries, especially in the South, would have been so eager to open up to Chinese investment of critical parts of their infrastructure. And I'm not just talking about the Port of Piraeus, which is usually mentioned. I think the development and the investment there is critical, and I think it has had an added value. But I'm also talking about Portugal's electricity grid. I'm also talking about other states who saw critical aspects of digital innovation companies, being, sold off. There's that whole debate about golden visas, in many European states. So if I wouldn't dare to comment on how the Greek experience can be emblematic of a European approach, but I would want the EU to focus on some of its own mistakes in the past and see them as mistakes. Foresight needs to be injected in the way we approach our foreign policy. Not only vis-a-vis China, also vis-a-vis the US. I mentioned, for example, that we were, as Europe, we spent a lot of time being in denial as to who we were discussing with on the other side of the Atlantic. So foresight on the basis of thinking, not autonomy as autarky, but autonomy as managing some level of independence and some dependence needs to be injected. And I think Greece, with the kind of measures that were introduced and were demanded to be implemented, offers a valuable lesson as to how one action might serve one purpose, but in the long term to be antithetical to the long-term strategic interest of the EU as a whole.
Thank you, Vasilis. Yes, please, Marilena, and then Konstantinos.
Okay, thank you very much. So, for us, the question of the crisis, let me start from that, c'est déjà vu, because now it's after 10 years of severe economic crisis in the country, with many sacrifices of the Greek people, we face a very, very big crisis. The difference is that in this crisis, we are not alone, and that's make the whole difference. In the crisis of 2010, we were the bad guys with a corrupted country, as they accused, that we had to be punished. Now there is a sense of necessity, especially for the countries of the South, to create a common front in order to face the new reality after the pandemic. So we expect to see what this recovery fund will give. Still nothing is clear, no clear decisions yet, but at least there is a group of countries with common interests and important countries in this group as Italy or Spain that will really fight for at least not to have a new conditionality as some countries of the North are. So, but now let me come to the question of China. I just want to build a little bit on what Vasilis said, with whom I absolutely agree. For the countries of the South, China's economic penetration was not a choice. There was not an option. It was a necessity. There was not any important investment coming from EU countries. So investment of the size of the Piraeus port, which has really changed the Attica, the whole of Attica, making Piraeus one of the biggest ports in the Mediterranean and in Europe, has really changed a lot. So nobody can come in Greece, as unfortunately President Macron did some years, and say, do not listen to sirens coming from the east. I can buy this if I have an alternative, which as Greece, I don't have. But this, on the other side, does not mean that we have to make, not to follow principles and values. I was really shocked when my country did not vote in the European Council for sanctions against China on the question of human rights. I mean, each country has to strike the right balance between keeping up to its European obligations, at least at the level of principles and values, and of course the economic necessities and the economic priorities. Not give the impression that you're sold out to China. But it's not always an easy equation.
Thank you, Marilena. Konstantinos wanted to yes.
I should have taken the floor before Marilena because she covered me. Very briefly, some lessons to be learned from the Greek case. Back in 2010, shortly after we entered the bailout program, the Chinese acquired 10 billion of Greek bonds in the secondary market as a goodwill gesture to Greece. This couldn't solve, of course, our debt crisis and our debt problem, but still it was a goodwill gesture on behalf of the Chinese to showcase that they think that Greece has a critical role to play in their planning with regard to the European Union and the trade routes, etc. Second, as Marilena very correctly said, we were desperate in attracting investments back then, and we are still want to attract investments. And whenever I was talking to a European or an American colleague, letting him know that there is a gap and somebody is going to fill it in, if it's not you, the response was that, yes, but the Chinese and the Russians, the Chinese specifically, if they take a decision, most of their companies are state-controlled, so they can implement it directly. They don't need time. Whereas in the case of European and American companies, it takes time and it's not as easy, even if there is a political will to support a given investment. Third, Greece, in May 2019, if I'm not mistaken, April or May 2019, entered in this 16+1, which became 17+1 platform of China. And the last point, but Marilena mentioned it, it was twice that we blocked a European decision against China, whereas we didn't block, although it was mentioned by foreign minister back in 2015, any sanctions against Russia. So Greece, which is accused and has been accused traditionally as serving as a Trojan horse of Russia within the European Union, which of course has not ever been the case, was the country that blocked twice decisions that were about to be made against China, but never blocked any kind of sanctions against Russia, although these sanctions damage or at least have a negative impact on our export market, which is, of course, part of it is destined to Russia.
Thank you, Konstantinos. I'm going to get now to some of the questions that have come in online. So, question from our chat. The differences between the EU members due to their national interests create difficulties in the decision-making process on the European level. For that reason, EU is unable to intervene effectively. How can we get over that? It's a very EU-focused question. I'm sure, I think both Vasilis and Marilena have mentioned it previously. But it's also a very important question. Please, Anna, yes.
Maybe I can add something, taking the example of China, because I find it very interesting was what was mentioned by the previous speakers with regards to the relationship between Greece and China. And I very much agree with that. And I find it a bit of a pity that I think here in Berlin and in Germany, people are not so much aware of the perspective of southern countries with regards to China. And the fact that Chinese investment actually is a consequence of the fact that often there's a lack of European solidarity. And so my answer to the question would be, a first step would actually be to really be aware of the different interests of different European member states. And the example of China really shows that European member states have different kind of interactions and interests with China. If we look at Germany's relationship with China, of course, Germany sometimes also did not vote for stronger human rights policy with regards to China, because we are an export nation and we want to trade with China. And therefore, we are also sometimes not so critical when it comes to human rights issues. So for me, really, the first step would be to be aware of the different interests of different European member states, and then to find a way how to compensate. If we agree on a common foreign policy with regards to China, we need to compensate then those countries who might lose out in the formulation of this common foreign policy.
Marilena, yes.
It's a question to Anna. It's just a reaction, and I wanted your opinion. I very much understand what you say. You did not vote for sanctions against China because of the economic relations. But still, Germany on other issues, for example, arm exports to Saudi Arabia, it stopped, voted the embargo to arms exports with Saudi Arabia, even if Saudi Arabia is also a very important client of German industry. So how would you comment on this pick and choose, on having strict values on human rights accusation and this difference between the two?
And there again, I think the answer would be complex, because in Germany, so we have a coalition government, and there as well, we see that different parties have different priorities. Some parties, of course, for them, the human rights issues are much more important than for others that focus much more, of course, on industrial and business relations. So I think that might also explain why sometimes Germany is very strict and sometimes it isn't, because it's a negotiation between different political parties that have different agendas.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Vasilis.
Just a quick word on the way forward for foreign policy. I've long advocated for the introduction of QMV, of qualified majority voting, in foreign security affairs at the EU level. This is a profoundly difficult, but hugely important undertaking. This cannot be done overnight. We can start with areas that are a little bit inoffensive. For example, President Juncker had advocated in his 2018 State of the Union speech that we can start with human rights, civilian missions. You know, there's areas we can start that discussion. I know this is hugely problematic, not only for smaller countries that they feel that their voice will be diluted, but also for bigger countries that are not used to having their voice prevail. And I'm going not to name names here, but I think some of these case studies have been mentioned as country examples during our discussion. So this is the general direction of travel. And I think if we move towards that, I know there's a risk awareness towards treaty changes and all that, but it might actually mean that we listen more attentively to each other. After a decade of a crisis, it's still very surprising to hear that Berlin hasn't fully grasped the dilemmas that the Greek government 10 years ago had to face. You know, if we move towards an institutional framework where every player feels a little bit more vulnerable, then it might mean that we might end up not just agreeing on the lowest common denominator, but upgrading our ambition by listening a little bit more attentively to each other. And QMV has been one of the ideas that has been mentioned, and I fully subscribe to that.
Thank you, Vasilis. We still have more or less 10 minutes. So if any of you has any final comments, or maybe we could get another question. I was thinking also of NATO and the future of NATO. Especially here in Greece, when we think of NATO, we think of Turkey and Russia and the US, of course. We never think of China. But what is the American approach to this? Do the Americans, the Washington, take into consideration NATO when they think of their relations with China or Chinese involvement in European relations? Tori?
I can jump in here. I don't think there are any illusions in the United States that NATO is suddenly going to become engaged in the South China Sea or take a broader role in the Asia Pacific or out of area operations with regard to China. But I do think that it was a heartening or positive move to see Secretary General Stoltenberg on the eve of the December 2019 summit say that NATO is looking at China as a more serious concern, not with regard to what it's seeing in Asia, but with regard to Chinese enhanced engagement in the Arctic, in Europe, in purchasing critical infrastructure such as ports, in Africa. And so I think we are starting to see, at least strategically, a shift from NATO, from leadership, focusing on China as an increasing concern, also in cyberspace, but that we are unlikely and it would perhaps be infeasible to see NATO take a larger role where U.S. national security interests are perhaps most concerned, like that be in the South China Sea or in the Asia Pacific more broadly.
Thank you very much.
George, excuse me, can I ask Tori something following your question?
Of course, please.
What she thinks will be the impact if President Trump is re-elected in November with regard to NATO? He has described it as an obsolete organization. President Macron, as you know, has very strong comments about NATO. He has made some very strong comments about NATO. So do you think that a second term of Trump would have a further negative impact on NATO, or that, the US will remain devoted and engaged, and nothing is going to change?
It's a great question, Konstantinos. I think it comes down to how you measure NATO effectiveness. On the one hand, if we look at NATO military capabilities, defense spending from NATO member states, it was not necessarily President Trump, but it was aggression from Russia and the invasion in eastern Ukraine, annexation of Crimea, that led to enhanced defense spending among NATO members from 2014 on. We also saw, in terms of an action from the Trump administration, increasing funding for the European, what's now called the European Defense and Deterrence Initiative that was started under the Obama administration as the European Reassurance Initiative, and a focus on enhancing US military presence in Eastern Europe as a response to, again, Russian aggression on the borders of Europe. So if we look at NATO capabilities in that sense, I think even if there were to be a second Trump administration, we're likely to see continued NATO defense spending increases, and also a focus on enhancing the eastern flank of NATO's member states. Where I think we're likely to see a detrimental effect of a second Trump administration is in the trust and cohesion aspects of NATO effectiveness. And this is where I think we've seen a deleterious effect from the Trump administration, constantly calling into question the relevancy, the value of the NATO alliance, leaving to question whether the United States would actually fulfill its security guarantees under Article 5. It's the intangible aspects of what makes NATO the most effective political military alliance in modern history. And I think this is where we could see a negative effect from a second Trump administration in that trust and cohesion aspect. But when it comes to military capabilities and spending, we have seen positive trajectories in recent years, positive developments in recent years that I would think would continue even under a second Trump administration.
Thank you, Tori. I have a question from our viewers. What are your opinions on the participation of third countries in PESCO? And what position would the German EU presidency take? Any thoughts on that? Tori?
No, I was just
No,
looking at
okay, thank you. The Europeans, maybe, Marilena, yes?
Yes. You know, this is the $1 million question, the participation of third countries, and it's not solved yet. And for example, one question, what is a third country? Is the UK considered a third country or not? Because this is also the fundamental question. Yeah. And it's fundamental because the UK is one of the big three of European defense. So we have worked together for many years, and the UK now, when it was in the EU, was against PESCO, the activation of the relevant article of the Lisbon Treaty. Now that it's out, is very hot in participating in PESCO projects. Other question, United States. This is a third country. Turkey also is very keen on participating. So it needs a very, very profound discussion to cover all aspects. I think the countries, at least that I've mentioned, are very keen in participating in PESCO projects, but the Europeans must take themselves the decision on how they view this cooperation with them. A cooperation on an ad hoc basis, I think it will be, in my view, absolutely necessary, because all the three I mentioned, are strong and important countries, but especially in the case of Turkey, where there are serious problems in Eastern Mediterranean, not only with Greece and Cyprus, but recently also with with France. There, I think this is a big question mark, and I would be very much interested if Anna could give us her idea on how the German presidency plans to work on that, because it's, in my view, a very, very open issue.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have much information. I think the problem with the German presidency right now is that they had a list of priority items, but everything has shifted because of the coronavirus. And even our Minister of Foreign Affairs said in the end, the presidency is now a coronavirus presidency. So there are a few other aspects that Germany wants to work on, but I think the priority really now is the recovery program and, of course, the MFF.
Thank you, Anna. Any more final thoughts? Vasilis, please.
Just on the German presidency, just a quick point, not on the defense aspect, which I admit only experts can intelligently and intelligibly speak. But I would like to mention something, a quip by Heiko Maas, the German foreign minister, who spoke recently at the ECFR Council of Councils, and he mentioned that European sovereignty should have as its first step an unsparing analysis of our strategic dependencies, be it technological, security, trade, or monetary related. So to go back to something that Professor Felis mentioned, in between strategic autonomy and strategic dependence, I think we're moving towards a definition of strategic autonomy, at least that's what I gathered from the German perspective, as the opposite of strategic dependencies rather than autonomous actorness. So in that sense, we're focusing more on the free from rather than on the free to. So if using that, and to the extent that it's shared and owned by other member states, using that as a compass, I think it's clear and might have an impact also on the defense domain, where I think the momentum must not be lost, and real dilemmas are being faced, being confronted. The Europe is being confronted with real dilemmas right now that it needs to provide, again, intelligent answers for.
Thank you, Vasilis. Konstantinos, yes.
Just one word on the energy dimension, because when we talk about Russia, we cannot leave the energy dimension aside. Two things. First, that the new energy fields that Russia is developing are much closer to its eastern borders with China rather than its western borders with the EU, which means that there is a new reality that we will be facing in the coming decades, meaning that Russia will reorient part of its exports to China, but still for a centralized economy like the Russian, the money coming from the EU market is crucial. And there is an interdependence between Russia and the EU. Just one last point. Let us not forget, actually, I would like to stress that the US is about to impose sanctions on European companies and German companies participating in the Nord Stream 2 project, which links directly Russia with Germany, bypassing Poland and other European states. And the kind of paradox here is that the Germans are searching for a common European stance against US's willingness to impose sanctions, whereas they didn't actually, how can I put it? They were not eager to develop this common European stance vis-a-vis Russia when they were talking about Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2, because energy is a very sensitive, from a security and not only point of view, issue. So each member state has its own interest, and there is no common European interest.
Thank you, Konstantinos. So we're at the end of our time. There are a lot of issues we raised, and I'm sure a lot of things that we will come back to at some point. Let me thank all of you for joining us and for your very interesting remarks. And a big thank you to our viewers as well. A big thank you to FES and to the Institute of International Relations. And hopefully we'll meet again soon, online or offline. So a big thank you to all of you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
very much.